say a man earns glory with the blade, but I learnt the truth the day mine drew blood for a lie. The sand beneath my feet was warm, still damp with the morning's crimson memory. I stood alone in the centre of the arena, the roar of the crowd still echoing in my skull like a distant storm. My chest heaved, not from the fight. No, that had ended, swiftly, but from the eyes. All of them. Watching, judging, cheering for death as if it were a feast. My name is Kaeso, born of no house, bred in no field. I was forged in chains and fire, just another nameless body thrown into the ludi to feed the Republic's hunger for spectacle. But I wasn't always a slave. 12 winters ago, I had a brother, Marcellus. He was the senator's son. I was his shadow. They called me the bastard, the boy born of a kitchen servant and a night no one admitted happened. Still, we grew together, trained with the same tutor, sparred with wooden swords beneath lemon trees, until the night I was sent away. Until the night our father, now Marcellus, sits in the governor's box, swathed in purple, a golden laurel on his brow. And I bleed for the entertainment of Rome. The morning of the betrayal was like any other. I oiled my arms, wrapped leather around my wrists, and kissed the wolf tooth hanging from my neck, the only piece of my mother I had left. Cassius, the Lannister, nodded as I passed. He never spoke more than necessary, just sharpened the blades and counted the coins. "I hear your match is with a new recruit," a voice said behind me. It was Varro, the Thracian. Built like a bull, but smarter than he looked. "They say he's quick, might even last a few minutes." I grunted, half a smile flickering. We both knew the outcome was already written. This was no real duel. It was a display. A lesson to the new batch of spectators. Kaeso the undefeated. The shadow wolf still owned the sand. But then I saw the face. He stepped into the arena across from me, bare-chested, skin marked with fresh scars, young, maybe 19, eyes wide, but steady. He raised his blade awkwardly, the way only those who were taught too late do. And then he spoke. "Forgive me. I was promised freedom if I took your head." The world narrowed. Not the boy's words, but the name he whispered next. Marcellus sent me. For a moment I heard nothing. No crowd, no sand beneath my boots, no sun burning my shoulders. Just the boy's voice, just that cursed Marcellus. I stared at him. This trembling youth, too young to carry steel and too broken to carry lies. His sword shook in his grip, not from fear, but from shame. He wasn't a killer, he was a pawn. And my brother had placed him across from me. I should have struck him down. That's what the crowd wanted. They chanted my name, fists raised, demanding blood. I could feel their hunger, sharp and insistent, like the weight of every chain I had ever worn. Instead, I stepped back. "You don't want this," I muttered. He raised his blade anyway. I parried without thinking, knocking the weapon from his hand. It skittered across the sand, far from his reach. He didn't run, didn't cry, just knelt, head lowered, waiting. Not for mercy, for death. The overseer raised his hand to signal the final blow. I looked up, past the banners, toward the governor's box, and there he sat. Marcellus, draped in crimson, sipping wine, with that same hollow smile he wore when he watched our father bury my name. Our eyes met, and he raised his cup. That was when I knew. This wasn't just another fight. It was a message, a final humiliation. Kaeso the Invincible, beaten not by blade, but by memory. By blood. The boy's voice echoed again. They promised freedom. I lowered my sword. Then I dropped it. Gasps swept through the amphitheatre like wind across dry grass. The overseer shouted something, but I didn't hear. I stepped forward, reached down, and lifted the boy to his feet. Then I turned, back to Marcellus, and raised my fist. Not in salute, in defiance. The cells were colder that night. Or perhaps it was only me who had changed. No one spoke. Even the usual murmurs and clinks of chains were absent, swallowed by the silence I had dragged back with me from the sand. Kaeso summoned me at dawn. His voice, usually low and distant, carried a sharpness I hadn't heard before. "You cost us a fortune," he said simply, standing beneath the torchlight with his arms crossed. "And you made a fool of your house." I said nothing. What could I say? That I saw my brothers rot in the eyes of a child? That I had no blood left to spill for his entertainment? He studied me for a long time. Then he smiled. "You'll fight again, or you'll rot." That afternoon, I was not sent to train. I was sent to the pits, where broken men went to break others, not for show, not for glory, just pain. A lesson. They brought out Brutus, a Numidian twice my size, his face already a map of scars. His face already a map of scars. The guards tossed us into the mud. No weapons, no rules, just fists and fury. He hit me first. I tasted blood, heard ringing, fell, got up. He hit me again. I smiled. The third time, I struck back. Not with skill, but with memory. Each blow I landed whispered a name. Marcellus, Cassius, Rome. And when Brutus finally fell, groaning in the dirt, I didn't look at the overseer. I looked at the other slaves watching from the shadows. One of them nodded. That night, Varro approached my cell. He leaned against the bars and tossed me a crust of bread. "They say you refuse to kill," he said. Twice I didn't answer. "They also say your brother watches from velvet seats while you bleed in dust." That made me look up. "I had a brother too," Varro said. "Sold me for coin. I killed him with a spoon." He smiled, not cruelly. "You want revenge, Wolf? Then keep breathing. They can't humiliate a corpse." I chewed the bread in silence. The pit had not broken me. It had clarified me. I would fight again, but this time not for their cheers, not for my name, not even for freedom. I would fight for one moment, one strike, that would make Marcellus flinch, just once, so he'd know the shadow he tried to bury still moved, still burned, and was coming for him. The next day brought no weapons, only whispers. In the shadowed corners of the barracks, slaves began to look at me differently. Not as a champion, not even as a rebel, but as something else. A question that hadn't been asked aloud yet. What happens when a dog trained to bite refuses? What happens when it remembers its own name? I kept my head low and my hands busy. Cassius didn't speak to me again, but he didn't need to. My new role was made clear. No more parades in the sand, no more staged glory, just labor. I hauled water, cleaned stables, polished rust from shields I would no longer carry. But something curious happened. I began to see things. Patterns, routines, the soft parts in the iron skeleton of the ludus. Which guards drank early, which locks clicked twice, where the bread was stored and when. I didn't plan, not yet, but I observed, and others watched me watch. Varro, most of all. "You're thinking like a wolf again," he said one evening, squatting beside me while I sharpened a wooden post. "That's dangerous." I didn't answer. "Good," he grunted. "Thinking is the sharpest blade we have left." Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time bent around the sameness, until one evening, just before curfew, a boy slipped into the training yard. He was small, no older than 13, with eyes too wide for his face. He carried a letter clutched in a wax-sealed pouch. He asked for me by name. Cassius allowed it, perhaps for amusement. The boy knelt and whispered, "From someone in the Senate." He handed me the scroll and vanished. I didn't open it until nightfall. It was unsigned. The message was brief. "They'll send another. He'll wear blue. You will fall." No explanation, no name. But I knew exactly who had written it and who had ordered it. Marcellus wasn't finished. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on the straw, staring into the dark, fingers curled around the edge of the parchment. I thought of our childhood again. How we used to race up the orchard hill behind the villa. Him always ahead, laughing. I used to believe that meant he was stronger. Now I saw it for what it was. He never looked back. I always did. Always waited. No more. If he wanted to send another shadow to strike me, I would teach it to stand. And if he wanted me to fall, I would show him what it looked like to rise first. 2 days later, the crowd returned, their hunger sharpened by my silence, their cheers louder than ever. I stood once more in the arena, the sun merciless overhead, sand scorching my soles, the air vibrating with the sound of Rome demanding blood. The gates opened across from me, and there he was, blue tunic, gilded greaves, and a blade too clean to have seen real war. His name was Silvanus. He bowed theatrically to the audience before pointing his sword at me. I didn't move, didn't blink, just studied him. He was young, confident, fast, but something behind his movements told me everything I needed to know. He was rehearsed, not hardened. His strikes were clean but hollow. He had been trained to win with flair, not survive with fire. And he had been sent here to kill me. I let him swing first. The steel hissed past my shoulder. I stepped aside, let him dance. The crowd roared at his showmanship. I let them. I let him. But inside, I was counting. His steps, his breath, the angle of his blade. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to send a message. The third time he lunged, I caught his wrist, twisted, and brought him to the ground. Not with force, with knowledge. His sword flew. My foot came down on his chest. He gasped. I looked up toward the governor's box. Marcellus wasn't smiling this time. His hand gripped the edge of the marble railing, his jaw clenched. He leaned forward, waiting. For me to kill, to obey. I reached for Silvanus's throat. Not to end him, but to whisper, "You were sent to die." Tell him I refused. Then I released him. The crowd was stunned. The overseer looked to Cassius, who gave no sign. Silence spread like smoke. Then, unexpectedly, applause. Not for him, for me. They cheered not the fight, but the defiance. And I realized something then. Rome didn't love strength. Rome loved stories, and I had just given them a new one. That night, in the cells, Varro pressed his ear against the bars. "He won't like that," he whispered. "No," I replied. "He won't." I expected punishment. Instead, I received praise. A senator visited the ludus the next morning, offering coin, contracts, even a sculpture. The wolf who spares, they called me now. A symbol of Rome's mercy. I laughed, not loudly, just inside. They didn't understand. I wasn't sparing them. I was saving my blade for the one who deserved it. And Marcellus was finally starting to sweat. The days that followed were strangely quiet. No training matches. No public duels. Only silence and eyes. Eyes from across the yard, from behind pillars, from men who once laughed with me and now only watched. Even Varro, who had always kept near, stayed distant. Fame, I realized, was another kind of chain. Lighter, gilded, but binding all the same. I was no longer just a fighter. I had become something far more dangerous in Rome's twisted game, a symbol that couldn't be controlled. The guards no longer barked commands when I passed. The younger slaves whispered my name with a reverence that made me uneasy. Even Cassius had grown polite. He addressed me not as animal, but as Kaeso, a small shift. But in Rome, words could weigh as much as stones. Then came the invitation, a scroll bearing the governor's seal, delivered at midday with ceremony, usually reserved for diplomats. I read it once, twice, then burned it. It was not a request, it was a summons. Marcellus wished to dine with me. "He's rattled," Varro said when I told him. "You've put fear in the veins of a man who thinks himself a god. Now he wants to study you, dissect you." I nodded, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I remembered the boy, the one who said he'd be freed if he killed me. I remembered the curve of his blade, the way he'd knelt with such certainty. What had become of him? That night they dressed me in a fresh tunic, not silk, but linen. Enough to show I was being elevated, but not honored. I was paraded through the villa like a guest, yet still shadowed by guards. Rome's way of saying, "You are valuable, but only if you behave." Marcellus greeted me with outstretched arms and a smile too wide to mean peace. "Brother," he said, as if the word had never been stained. I said nothing. He led me to a marble table adorned with grapes, olives, roasted meat, and figs soaked in honey. Wine was poured. Flutes played in the distance. It was all for show. "You've become quite the story," he said, swirling his goblet. "The people love a contradiction, the merciful gladiator, the savage who spares." "And yet," I said slowly, "you sent another to kill me." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Politics," he said. "Nothing personal. Rome is a beast that feeds on blood. I merely serve it." "You sent a child," I said. "You always were sentimental." I stood. He rose too, wine sloshing from his cup. "You think this makes you powerful?" he hissed. "The crowd's love is as fickle as the forum's mood. Tomorrow they'll want your death." "I'll give it to them." I leaned close. "Then make sure it's not you standing across from me." Silence hung like smoke between us. Then he laughed. "You won't make it that far." I left without finishing the meal. Behind me, the villa loomed like a tomb dressed in gold. I walked back to the ludus under moonlight, stone in my stomach, flame in my chest. War had not yet begun, but it had chosen its battlefield. It began with bread. A loaf delivered to my cell at dusk, still warm, too fresh to have come from the kitchen used for the rest of us. Beneath it, tucked like a secret, was a folded scrap of parchment. No seal, no signature. Just a phrase, inked in trembling hand, "There are others." I read it twice, then tore it into pieces and swallowed them. Words could hang men in Rome. I told no one. But that night I watched more carefully. Varro coughed twice before sleep, an old signal from his days in the army, and one I'd heard before. A younger slave, often silent, scratched a circle into the dirt near the gate and covered it again with his heel. Small signs, subtle but real. The next morning I was summoned not to the arena, but to the storeroom. Unusual. They didn't waste warriors on chores when coin was involved. Inside, Cassius stood alone. He handed me a jug and gestured toward the grain crates. I approached cautiously, but nothing happened. No trap, no words, just silence. Until I saw it, scratched into the underside of the wooden lid. A symbol, the wolf, my mother's mark. The one she carved into the hearthstone the day they took me. I stared at it as if it might burn into my eyes. "There are others," I whispered. Not just fighters, not just slaves, but a network, a movement, and someone close, was part of it. That night, Varro approached my mat. He didn't speak, just sat beside me and offered a flask. We passed it back and forth in silence until he said, "There's a plan." I didn't ask what. I simply nodded. "Rome won't see it coming," he added. "But it has to start with a I looked at him then, not as a fellow fighter, but as something more. A man who had buried his pain in silence long enough. A man who was done kneeling. "Tomorrow," I said. "The next fight. Make it count." He grinned, teeth like broken stones. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next day, the crowd roared louder than before. Word had spread. The wolf returns. Kaeso the merciful. Kaeso the rebel. They wanted a show. They would get a war. As I stepped into the arena, the sun cut across the sand like a blade. My opponent was already waiting. Muscles coiled, nerves tight, blade gleaming, but I barely saw him. My eyes were on the east gate, where a guard I knew, one who owed me coin, was scheduled to blink at the fourth chair. One blink, one sign, that's all we needed. The bell rang, we circled. I parried once, let the crowd scream, and then feigned a stumble. He lunged, I caught his arm, whispered in his ear, "Yield or die for someone else's games." He hesitated, dropped his blade. Confusion rippled through the crowd. And then, from the gate, the blink. Varro roared. From the side wall, two slaves lunged at a distracted guard. Chaos, shouts, steel, dust. Rome's perfect show began to fall apart. Chaos is loud, but rebellion is louder. The arena erupted into madness. Some thought it was part of the show. Rome loved a twist after all, but the illusion broke quickly when blood fell where it wasn't scripted. Varro took down the first guard with a shovel he'd sharpened for weeks. Others joined. Kitchen hands, stable boys, the mute man who cleaned the latrines. All wielded makeshift weapons and all wore the same look, not rage, not desperation, but purpose. I fought not to kill, but to clear paths. We had mapped the exits, timed the rotations, counted how long it took for reinforcements to arrive from the outer walls. It was not a riot, it was a campaign. I caught sight of Silvanus. He hadn't fled after our last match. Instead, he grabbed a spear from a stunned soldier and stood with us, eyes blazing. "Rome thinks you're still chained," he said, panting. "Let's show them how wrong they are." I nodded once. Then we moved. From the holding pens to the training yard, we swept like fire. Guards fell. Gates broke. Blood stained the walls, but so did handprints. Defiant, red, and rising. Marcellus's seat in the governor's box had been empty when it began. But now he appeared, flanked by soldiers, eyes wide with the realization that his story had slipped from his control. I saw him bark orders, saw panic ripple through his ranks. We had planned for that too. The outer corridors, once used for chariot storage, now became traps. We lured soldiers in, sealed exits with carts and torches, turned the maze they'd built for beasts into their own coffin. By midday, the ludus was ours. Bodies littered the sands. The cheers of the crowd had long since been replaced with screams, then silence, then a terrified hush. And yet, I felt no triumph. Not yet. Not until the gates to the villa opened. Not until I stood on the marble steps, dust and blood on my skin, and stared up at the man who had sent boys to kill me, who had called me brother when it suited him, and ghost when it didn't. "Kaeso," he said, as if we had met at a feast, not a battlefield. "You've made quite the mess." "Clean it yourself," I said. Then I stepped forward. The villa was quiet. Too quiet. As if even the walls held their breath. Marble floors gleamed beneath the blood tracked in by our feet. Statues of gods looked down at us, unmoved, indifferent. I walked at the head of the column, Varro to my left, Silvanus behind. The others fanned out across the halls like shadow. We encountered no resistance. Marcellus had pulled back his personal guard, locking them within the upper chamber. He hadn't fled. That much surprised me. I thought he would vanish, as he had the night they sent me away, leaving nothing but silence in his place. But no. He waited in the atrium, standing between two pillars like a statue granted breath. His tunic was white, clean, untouched by the blood Rome demanded of others. "You could have ruled," he said as I approached. "I gave you every chance." "You gave me chains," I replied, "and names I never asked for." He looked tired now, older. Lines creased his brow that no laurel could hide. "You always had a choice. And you always had a sword," I said. I stepped closer. No blade in my hand, only truth. The room was still, save for the dripping of a broken fountain. "Why?" I asked. "Why the boy, the letters, the games?" Marcellus didn't blink. "Because Rome forgets, and I couldn't let them remember you." He stepped forward. "You were a mistake, one I tried to bury, but you kept standing. So you tried to end me in the arena? Better there than at my side." For a moment, I saw the boy he had once been, the one who held my hand as we ran through olive groves, who cried when I bled during training, who whispered dreams of conquest beneath blankets when the night was loud with thunder. Then I saw the man, the senator, the coward, the orchestrator of my erasure. I raised my hand, not in threat, in judgment. "You are nothing without your name," I said, "and I have become everything without mine." His lip curled. "You think they'll follow you now?" "They followed the story, not the man." "Then I'll give them a better one." I turned to the others. "Lock him in the lower chamber. Strip his titles. Let him eat what we ate, live what we live." "You can't," he growled. "I'm Rome." "No," I said. "You're what it wants to forget." As they dragged him past the statues of gods, he thrashed, shouted, pleaded. But no one listened. Rome didn't care about the fall of men, only their performance. And Marcellus had reached the end of his act. I stood in the atrium, silence swirling around me like smoke. Varro approached. "And now?" he asked. I looked toward the open doors, toward the city beyond. "Now we build something that doesn't need chains to stand." The sun rose slower that morning, or maybe it only felt that way because we stood still long enough to watch it. The arena was quiet now, no longer echoing with the chants of blood-drunk crowds. The sand had been cleared, the broken weapons removed, and what remained was something I had never seen there before. Peace. Men swept the corridors, not out of fear, but duty. The wounded were tended, not discarded. And for the first time since I had arrived as a slave, the gates were open, not to parade us, but to release us. The city beyond still breathed with suspicion. Rome never changed overnight, but word had spread that the wolf had spared, that the fighter had spoken, that one man had knelt and then stood tall. There would be consequences, but also echoes. One senator came to speak to me, not to threaten but to understand. He asked what I wanted. Land? Gold? A title? I smiled. "None," I said. "Only truth." He left, confused. I didn't care. Truth wasn't for them. It was for us. For the nameless who died without song. For the forgotten whose blood fertilized the foundation of marble palaces. For the mothers who never knew where their sons had been buried. I stood in the center of the arena one last time, not as a prisoner, not even as a victor, but as a witness. Varro stood beside me, arms crossed, a scar freshly stitched across his cheek. "Will you leave?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, "but not today." "You planning to rule this place?" "No," I said. "I plan to empty it." He laughed. "Then what?" "We teach," I said. "We train those who were broken to stand, not for a crowd, for themselves." "And Rome?" he asked. I looked toward the horizon. "Rome will watch. It always does. But for once we will not perform. We will live." As the sun reached its peak, the shadow of the arena shrank behind me. I stepped out of its circle, dust still clinging to my boots, but no longer to my name. I was not Kaeso the Gladiator, not Kaeso the Shadow. I was simply Kaeso, free. Not because someone granted it, but because I took it back. And in the silence of that final moment, with no roar, no audience, no death, I felt something Rome had never taught me to expect. Peace. When I opened my eyes, the world around me was unfamiliar, yet strangely vivid. The scent of clay, smoke, and something sweet, maybe honey, lingered in the air. A linen curtain swayed gently beside a narrow window, revealing glimpses of a sun-drenched courtyard. I sat up slowly on a hard, low wooden bed. The mattress was stuffed with straw, and it creaked beneath me. I rubbed my eyes, still adjusting to the soft golden light that spilled across the mosaic floor. Somewhere outside, I could hear the bustling rhythm of the city. Sandals clapping against stone, a woman scolding a child, the call of a fruit seller. This was no dream. I was in ancient Rome. The room was modest, maybe belonging to a lower-class citizen or a freedman. A single terracotta lamp rested on a small wooden stool beside the bed. A folded tunic lay neatly on the other end. I noticed a chipped cup filled with water on the floor and took a careful sip. Lukewarm, metallic. My fingers brushed against the walls, coarse and cool, and my ears tuned in to the symphony of morning life outside. With cautious curiosity, I stood and dressed in the tunic. It felt rough, hand-woven, not like the soft cotton I was used to. Slipping on simple leather sandals, I stepped into the sunlight of the courtyard. The warmth was immediate, wrapping around my skin like a gentle embrace. Chickens clucked nearby, and a young boy darted past me, chasing one with laughter. A woman in a faded blue stole was kneeling beside a basin, washing laundry with slow, practiced motions. I crossed the courtyard and stepped into the narrow alley beyond. It was already alive with activity. The aroma of baking bread and spiced wine drifted from a nearby tavern. A man in a toga passed me, adjusting his belt and muttering to himself. Two slaves carried amphorae on their shoulders, grunting under the weight as they turned into a side street. From somewhere nearby, a priest chanted in Latin, his voice echoing above the rooftops. The city seemed to breathe with purpose. I walked slowly, trying to take it all in. The cracked paving stones beneath my feet, the red graffiti scratched onto walls, the faded frescoes of gods and soldiers on plastered facades. Every corner revealed a new rhythm of life. Vendors calling out their wares, children darting between stalls, and old men arguing politics near the public fountain. I passed a small shrine built into a wall where a woman lit a candle and whispered a prayer before moving on. Suddenly, the scent of roasted meat caught my attention. I turned a corner and found myself in front of a small taberna. Inside, men huddled over bowls of lentils and cups of watered wine, their conversation rising and falling like waves. A large man behind the counter eyed me briefly, then returned to slicing cheese. I stepped inside, nodding politely. No one seemed surprised to see me. It was as if I belonged here. And maybe, for today, I did. Outside the taberna, the street bent toward the heart of the district. As I walked, the murmur of voices grew louder, deeper, more layered. The forum was near. I turned a corner, and it opened before me like a stage. A wide public square, paved in stone, stretched out under the sun, surrounded by colonnaded buildings and statues of forgotten heroes. Stalls lined the edges, each draped in cloth and overflowing with goods. Bread, olives, copper trinkets, dyed wool, amphorae filled with oil and wine. The scent of the market was overpowering. Sweet dates, acrid vinegar, sweat and incense smoke wafted together in a blend that clung to the skin. A boy with a reed flute played a wobbly tune near the steps of the basilica. A butcher, his apron stained red, called out today's specials while waving a cleaver. A pair of matrons stood beneath a fig tree, gossiping behind fans, their hair pinned high with ivory combs. Everywhere there was motion, lively, loud, beautiful chaos, Roman life unfolding in its rawest form. I was bumped by a man carrying scrolls. "Oculi tui, amici," he muttered. "Watch your eyes, friend." I nodded, unsure how to respond, and kept walking. It was easy to get lost here, in the noise, in the people. I watched a child slip a fig from a vendor's tray, darting off before the woman could scold him. She only smiled and shook her head. Perhaps this was a daily occurrence. In the center of the forum stood a large marble fountain. Its rim was worn smooth by centuries of hands and resting elbows. I dipped my fingers into the cool water, savoring the moment. Nearby, a speaker stood atop a box, passionately decrying some governor's new tax. His words rose like flames, igniting murmurs among the gathered listeners. Some clapped, some rolled their eyes, and others simply moved on. Politics, I realized, was no different back then. It was performance. Their demeanor was relaxed. They leaned against pillars, munching dates and watching the street like lazy lions. One of them winked at the passing girl, who responded with a snort of amusement. An old man in a tattered toga approached me, offering carved bone dice for a coin. "For Fortuna," he whispered. "She favors the bold." I took one from his hand, rough, yellowed, with faded pips, and gave him a coin. He bowed and vanished into the throng. I turned the die in my fingers. Perhaps today I'd be bold. A soft bell rang in the distance. It came from the direction of the temple, midday prayers. I wasn't sure what gods were worshipped here, or whether belief still meant the same in this place, but the sound was grounding. I looked around and saw others pausing, some making gestures, others continuing without care. Above me, gulls circled in the bright blue sky, their cries sharp and foreign. I felt strangely at peace. Megna abroia chicked. Roma pulsed around me, alive, restless, ancient, and new all at once. As the forum emptied and the sun climbed higher, the heat began to press down like an invisible weight. The crowds thinned. Shopkeepers leaned in the shade of their stalls. Dogs napped beneath archways. Even the ever-chattering vendors grew quiet, their calls softening into lazy murmurs. The city, for a brief moment, paused. I followed the flow of people toward the bathhouse, a public therme that stood like a palace among the humbler buildings. Its entrance was marked by 2 towering columns, flanked by statues of gods whose names I didn't know, but whose presence felt eternal. Inside, the air shifted, humid, scented with myrrh and sweat and warm stone. My sandals echoed across marble as I entered the changing area. Men should have dressed, chatting and laughing, some wrapping themselves in towels, others rubbing oil into their arms. An attendant gestured politely and handed me a small jar of scented olive oil. I nodded, mimicking those around me, unsure of the ritual but curious. I stepped into the tepidarium first, the warm room. Moisture clung to the walls and my skin began to glisten immediately. I sat on a stone bench and closed my eyes. The sound of dripping water, low voices, and an occasional splash filled the space like a living lullaby. Io Esistine. After a time, I moved to the caldarium, the hot bath. The heat wrapped around me like a second skin. A man nearby exhaled deeply, as if the warmth was drawing out all the burdens of his day. I dipped myself into the steaming pool, letting go of time. The water was deep and quiet. No one rushed. No one spoke above a murmur. Here, Rome breathed slowly. Later, in the frigidarium, the cold water was a shock. I gasped as I submerged myself, feeling every nerve wake from slumber. The sensation was but cleansing. I emerged renewed, my skin tingling. I dried off slowly under an archway where filtered sunlight danced through steam and dust. Outside, the world had not changed, but I had. There was a certain stillness inside me now, like a lake that had finally gone calm. I walked with slower steps, no longer just observing, but somehow belonging. The noise of the city returned, muted but present. Laughter, the clink of metal, a distant cart rolling over cobblestones. I found a stone bench beneath a vine-covered wall and sat for a while. An old woman beside me hummed softly, knitting something from coarse wool. A cat slinked by and brushed against her leg. She smiled, but said nothing. I returned the silence. Not all moments needed words. In the distance, bells rang again. Later this time, more melodic. Maybe they signaled afternoon offerings or a magistrate's decree. It didn't matter. I leaned back against the warm stone and let my eyes close. The sun pressed gently against my eyelids, and for a moment, I forgot the world I had come from. Rumour had rid me of his own, and I had begun to match it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the city softened once more. Shadows stretched long across the stone roads, and the golden light turned amber, then rose, then dimmed altogether. The warmth of the day faded into a gentle breeze that rustled olive branches and carried the faint scent of ash and rosemary through the alleys. I stood at the edge of the Tiber River, watching its slow, constant current move past worn boats and quiet figures on the shore. A fisherman reeled in his last catch beneath a crumbling arch. Children tossed pebbles into the water, their laughter now quieter, fading like echoes. The city didn't sleep, not yet, but it sighed, as if content with what the day had offered. I wandered through narrow back streets lined with ivy and silence. Lamps flickered behind windows, casting warm halos against worn plaster walls. I passed a man closing the shutters of his shop, whistling an old tune. Farther down, two women sat on steps, sharing bread and speaking in hushed tones. The world was exhaling. The domicile awakening greeted me like an old friend. The courtyard, now dim, still held the heat of the day and its bricks. I returned to the small room where it all began. The curtains swayed gently once again. I sat on the wooden bed, letting my sandals rest beside me. A single oil lamp glowed on the stool, its flame dancing, but steady. Outside, a nightbird sang somewhere in the dark. I lay back and listened to the distant clatter of hooves on stone, to laughter drifting from a nearby home, to the hush of the wind weaving through narrow lanes. Rome had given me a day, a single full ordinary day, but nothing about it felt ordinary now. I had seen its rhythm, tasted its bread, felt its heat and coolness, and walked among its people. It had welcomed me, not as a visitor, but as someone who, for a few precious hours, belonged. The air grew cooler. The lamp's flame dipped low. I pulled a light woolen blanket over myself and turned to face the curtain, now still. And as my eyes began to close, I let Rome fall asleep with me. Together we dreamed. The first thing I remembered was the cold iron around my wrists. Not the scent of the sea, nor the heat of the sun, but the weight of chains that had become part of my body. I was called Livius now, though that was not my true name. My real name, the one my mother had whispered to me under stars far from Rome, had long since been stolen, forgotten in the smoke of conquest. They had taken us on a ship, crammed beneath the deck like cargo, the scent of vomit and rot thick in the air. When we arrived, the sky above the Tiber looked no different than home. But everything else had changed and was sold at a market 3 days later. A tall man with a crimson cloak and a broken tooth bought me after thumbing my shoulders like he was judging a melon. I remember his words. Strong back, quiet eyes, good for the furnace or the fields. That was 6 years ago. Since then, I had belonged to the household of Gaius Valerius Marcellus, a mid-ranking official who spoke little and smiled even less. His villa was vast, perched above the river with columns that caught fire each evening in the orange light. I lived below, in the cellar with the other labourers. We were given stale bread, a bucket for water, and strict rules. No speaking after dark, no lingering in the courtyard. And above all, never look directly at the lady of the house. My days were filled with labour. I hauled firewood, scrubbed marble floors until my fingers bled, and swept the ashes from Gaius's study after his endless scroll readings. He fancied himself a philosopher. His words were poison wrapped in silk. Freedom is an illusion the ignorant cherish. But it was her voice I feared more than his. To Misha, his wife, was as beautiful as she was cruel. A single raised eyebrow could mean a whipping. She carried herself like a goddess and spoke to us only in commands. One morning I met her gaze by accident, while carrying a basket of figs. She said nothing, but later that night, I was dragged from my pallet and beaten until I could no longer see straight. In those moments, I learned what survival meant. Silence, obedience, invisibility. But last night, everything changed. There was a guest at dinner, an old senator whose face I did not see. I was serving wine when I overheard their conversation. He spoke of unrest in the south, of slaves escaping in the hills, forming bands, hiding in the ruins of old temples. A flame and dry grass, he said. It only needs wind. I didn't sleep at all. I lay staring at the beams above me, heart pounding, for the first time in 6 years. Something moved inside me. Not hope, not yet, but something more dangerous. Curiosity. The next morning began like every other, grey, silent, and soaked in the scent of ash. I rose before the rooster's call, joints aching, and joined the others in the courtyard. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. We had learned each other's movements, our miseries forming a silent language of glances and gestures. As I carried bundles of kindling to the furnace, my eyes strayed toward the hills beyond the city walls. I had never noticed how green they were, how free they looked. For a moment, the words of the senator echoed in my head. Slaves hiding in the ruins, moving like ghosts through forgotten paths. I shook the thought loose and lowered my head. It was to invite pain. But that day, everything seemed louder. The clink of chains, the grunts of the overseer, the hiss of Domitia's voice as she berated the cook for a burned crust. Each sound scraped against my skin like broken pottery. I found myself gripping the handle of a broom tighter than usual, and when Gaius passed by me in the atrium, reciting verses about fate and obedience, I nearly spat. Instead, I bent my knee. By midday, I was assigned to help in the lower storeroom. The walls were lined with clay amphorae, sealed and stamped with the mark of the house. Grain, oil, salt. And at the far end, wine. Sweet Falernian, imported from the coast, locked behind a gate I had never touched. Nicklick im Gensen Feiliginden Dore. I stared at it, longer than I should have. A flicker of madness, or perhaps destiny, stirred in my chest. I could take one bottle, slip it beneath my tunic, offer it to a guard, to a courier, to anyone with influence, trade it for a favour, trade it for a name, trade it for the first step out. But my hand still moved. Instead, I cleaned the floor with a rag soaked in vinegar and waited until the steward returned. I said nothing. I always said nothing. That was how you lived. That night, I found myself in the sleeping chamber again, eyes wide open, heart restless. I thought of my mother for the first time in years. Not her face, but her voice. She used to hum when she worked, even when the rains ruined the crops, or my father came home bleeding from another tax collection. She said the body could be bound, but the spirit was a river. I hadn't felt like a river in a long time. I began to count the days since I'd arrived in Rome. I stopped after 2,000. The number didn't matter. What mattered was that I could count. I was not broken. Not yet. The following days blurred together. Sweat, smoke, and silence. But something inside me had shifted, even if no one else could see it. My tasks were the same. My chains still chafed. But I moved through the villa differently now. I observed, I listened, and I remembered. There were patterns in the household. Times when Gaius left for the baths. When Domitia retreated to her garden to speak with her caged birds. When the guards drank too much sour wine and dozed in the shade. I started to map these moments in my mind, like a soldier planning a campaign. On the fourth day, I took a step. It was small, just a strip of cloth. Torn from a discarded tunic, I tucked it behind a loose stone near the stables, pressing it into the gap with shaking fingers. It wasn't much, just a marker, a test to see if anyone noticed. No one did. The next day, I moved a step further. I slipped a broken nail from the trash pile and hid it in my bedding. To most, it was garbage, but to me, it was proof. Proof that I could act. That I still had choice, however small. That night, I began whispering, only to myself at first, then to Dato, the older slave who slept near me. He had been here for 10 winters, his back a map of whip scars, his voice cracked like old leather. At first, he said nothing, just looked at me with tired eyes. But on the third night, he whispered back, "Careful, Libius," he said. "Words are heavier than chains." "But was listened," he said. I told him about the senator's words, about the hills and the ruins, about the old gods who still watched from broken temples. I told him I wasn't sure what I believed, but I was sure I couldn't die here, nameless and bent. He said nothing at first. Then, on the 5th night, he handed me something wrapped in cloth, a tiny piece of flint into which, for when the time comes, he said, it was heavier than it looked. The next morning, I worked as usual. I scrubbed floors, hauled firewood, nodded at commands, but each time I bent down, I felt a flint in my pocket like a second heartbeat. I wasn't ready to run. Not yet. But I was no longer standing still. The flint stayed hidden in the hem of my bedding, wrapped in old cloth and secrecy. I never touched it during the day, but every night, when I lay on my back staring at the low-beamed ceiling, I would reach for it. Not to use, but to feel. It reminded me that something waited, that I had not imagined the crack in the wall. Data spoke little after that night, but his silence was changed. It wasn't fear anymore, it was watchfulness. He began to point things out in small gestures. When the cellar guards changed shifts, which steward had a habit of sleeping early, which gates were left unlocked too long when supplies were delivered. Then came Alia. She was new to the household, but only weeks ago. Young, with dark, guarded eyes, and a walk that spoke of defiance not yet beaten out. She was assigned to kitchen work, and though we rarely crossed paths, I noticed how she watched everything, especially the overseers. One day I caught her eye while unloading grain, and for a moment, something passed between us. Not a smile, not a word, just recognition. A mirror held up between strangers. That night, Doctor whispered, "She hears things, learns fast." So I tested the waters. The next day I dropped a folded scrap of linen near her foot while delivering wood. An accident, nothing more. But when I returned an hour later, it was gone. In its place, a stone with a slash carved into its surface. A sign. A reply. She was with us. The three of us never spoke directly. It was too dangerous. Instead, we used what we had. Scraps, gestures, glances. We mapped a language made of nothing and carried everything. At night, I scratched patterns into the dirt beside my sleeping mat and erased them before the light returned. Every day, the house continued as if unchanged. Gaius ranted about politics. Domitia threw cups when her tea was too cold. The guards laughed with meat in their teeth. But beneath it all, something was moving. A thread pulled taut. The night the storm came, it was Aelia who made the first true move. She slipped into the storage cellar, soaked from rain, pretending to search for dry cloth. She paused near the amphora and left a folded wax tablet beside the wine jars. Later, when I retrieved it, the message was simple, scratched in a child's hand. 3 nights, Northgate, after second watch. I burnt the tablet in the furnace. My hands shook for hours, not because I was afraid, because for the first time in years I believed escape was no longer a myth. It had become a plan. The next 3 days moved like molasses, tick, slow, and heavy with anticipation. Every breath I took felt like it echoed too loudly in my chest. I watched the sun rise and fall with the precision of a soldier counting the hours to battle. By day, nothing changed. I carried wood. Aelia stirred pots and sliced roots in the kitchen. Datto limped through his chores, slower than he used to be, but still sharp beneath the wear of age. We said nothing out of the ordinary. Our faces stayed blank, our movements dull and mechanical. But beneath it all, something hummed. Tension, like a taut bowstring. At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake, eyes fixed on the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the rhythms of the villa, the distant laughter of gods, the soft clatter of cups, the creak of the olive press turning in the dark. I memorized every sound, not out of curiosity, but survival. One wrong noise could cost us everything. The night before the escape, the rain returned. Not a storm this time, but a quiet drizzle, enough to muffle footsteps and mask soft whispers. I took it as a sign. Rome wept for us, or perhaps it cleansed the path ahead. That morning, I saw Domitio for what I hoped would be the last time. She passed by the hallway where I was polishing the brass trays, her perfume trailing like smoke. She didn't look at me. She never did. But I looked at her fully. For once, I allowed myself to see the face of the woman who had once ordered my beating over a broken bowl. And I felt nothing. Not hate, not fear. Yes, distance. She was already part of a world I no longer belonged to. That night, the plan moved. Daffo feigned illness, used after dusk, clutching his side and groaning loud enough for the steward to fetch a draught of wine laced with herbs. Aelia spilled an entire pot in the kitchen, drawing the overseer into a long string of curses and distraction. I slipped from the courtyard during the noise, moving low past the animal pens and into the shadows along the stone wall. The north gate was ahead. Just beyond it, olive trees, hills, and the broken aqueduct rumoured to lead to the old temple ruins. Aelia and I were to meet there. Dato would follow when he could, or not at all. He had said His part was done. I moved slow, he'd said with a grin days before. But you run like fire on dry grass. At the gate, I paused. No alarm, no voices, just wind and the soft patter of rain on clay tiles. I waited, and then, out of the dark, came Aaliyah. She emerged like a shadow born from the stones, silent, soaked, eyes blazing with more resolve than fear. For a moment we simply looked at each other, the rain tracing lines down our faces like tears we hadn't earned yet. Then she nodded. Once? And we ran. The gate creaked as we pushed it open. Too loud, too slow, but no one stirred behind us. Beyond lay the olive groves, twisted trees reaching like broken fingers toward the clouded sky. Our sandals sank into the wet earth as we sprinted uphill, breath catching, hearts pounding. We didn't speak. We didn't dare. Behind us, Rome slept. Ahead, only darkness. The path to the old aqueduct was half forgotten, barely a trail at all. Roots tugged at our ankles, branches scratched our arms. I could barely see, but I followed Alia's shape in the dark, trusting her instincts. Every sound, the hoot of an owl, the crack of a branch, made my muscles seize. Any moment could bring the shout of pursuit, but none came. At the aqueduct ruins, we paused beneath a collapsed arch. There, hidden in the grass, was what Datu had described. A pile of worn cloaks, a water skin, a crude satchel with dried meat and figs. Supplies he had gathered over weeks, hidden bit by bit beneath broken stones. He had planned more than he let on. We didn't speak until dawn light began to creep into the sky, casting silver on the damp stones. That's when I finally let myself breathe. "Bear out," I whispered. "For now," Alia said. Her voice was hoarse, but steady. We moved again at sunrise, careful and low. The goal was simple: reach the abandoned temple in the hills. From there, we could follow the shepherd's path east toward the coast, then disappear. Others had done it. Maybe we could too. We passed burned-out fields and broken statues, remnants of villages Rome had consumed like a beast swallowing its own tail. The world felt ancient but wild, like we'd stepped outside the walls, not just of a city, but of time itself. Well, that night, we lit no fire. We slept under a thicket, curled beneath Dato's stolen cloaks, our backs pressed to the earth. My body ached, my feet were raw, and my stomach growled with emptiness. But I was free. And that word, free, repeated itself in my chest like a second heartbeat. Fragile, new, sacred. I didn't know what waited ahead, but for the first time in years, the road behind me didn't matter more than the one ahead. By the third day beyond the walls, our limbs moved more from memory than strength. Hunger gnawed at us like rats beneath the skin. The figs were gone, the dried meat down to scraps. We drank from creeks we found by sound alone, and once from a basin carved into a shrine stone where moss floated in lazy spirals. We no longer spoke unless we had to. The silence was not mistrust, it was survival. Our breaths were counted, our steps calculated. Every movement was measured against the question, is it worth the noise? Then came the sound we feared most, hooves. Not many, 2, perhaps 3, moving slow, deliberate. A patrol. Not a chase yet, but close enough to taste the danger. Alia and I ducked into the tall brush. I pressed my back against a half-collapsed wall, the stones cold and damp against my skin. My heart slammed in my chest, wild and angry. "Stay low," she whispered. I nodded, swallowing the fear rising in my throat like bile. The riders passed, just beyond the grove, 2 men in cloaks, spears at their backs. They didn't speak, but their eyes scanned the trees like wolves sniffing blood. Only when the sound faded into the hills did we move again. That night, we sheltered inside the shell of an old barn. Half the roof was gone, but it was shelter, and the wind had teeth. I collapsed beside a rotting beam, limbs trembling. Aelia sat across from me, legs drawn to her chest. Neither of us lit a fire. There was no warmth that didn't cost too much. "You've done this before," I said quietly. She hesitated. "Once." I waited. It failed. Her voice was distant. "We got caught. 3 of us. I ran. The others didn't make it." We shared a crust of stolen bread in the dark, half a bite each. Later, as the wind howled through the broken walls, I thought of my father. A strong man, not cruel but hard. He once told me, "Chains are made of more than iron, boy. They're built from silence, fear, and habit." I hadn't understood then. Now I did. In the dark, I whispered to the ceiling, to the stars, to whatever gods still care to listen. "Break me if you must, but never bind me again." Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then silence. We reached the edge of the ruins just before dawn. The old temple stood like a wounded animal, its columns broken, its roof caved in, vines climbing its bones. It was once sacred, now forgotten, but for us it was a refuge. Aurelia knelt beside the altar and ran her fingers over the carvings. They were worn smooth by wind and time, but the outline of a goddess, Minerva perhaps, was still there, barely visible in the stone. "This is where they hide," she said. "The others." I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. Somewhere among these woods, these stones, were more like us. Broken bodies, unbroken wills. We rested briefly in the shadow of the ruin. My legs ached. My hands were blistered. Aelia had a shallow cut on her shin from where we'd crossed a rocky gully the night before. I tore a strip from my tunic and bound it. She didn't flinch. She just looked at me and said, "Don't wait if I fall." I didn't answer. Instead, I stood and looked to the east. Smoke? A thin trail, barely a breath, rising behind a hill. Not a wildfire, a camp maybe, or a scalp. "They are close," I said. "We move now," she replied. But we were tired, so tired, and tired men make mistakes. We made ours after sundown. We had just crested a ridge when we saw them. 3 riders, spears glinting in the moonlight. They hadn't seen us yet, but they would. The brush was too thin, the moon too bright. I grabbed Aelia's hand. "Split," I whispered. "The nose? They'll catch us both if we stay." She hesitated, but only for a breath. Then she nodded. We ran. Branches whipped my face. Stones rolled underfoot. Somewhere behind me, shouting. Then the sound of a horse crashing through thickets. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I ran until my lungs felt like fire, until my vision blurred and every heartbeat felt like a hammer strike. Then, nothing. No voices, no hoofbeats, just wind and my own breath. I collapsed behind a boulder, chest heaving. I waited. Minutes passed. Then a rustle. Soft, deliberate. Aelia. She dropped beside me, face pale but smiling. "I told you not to wait," she said. "I didn't. I lied." We didn't speak again that night. There was no need. But in the dark, I knew something had changed. They knew we were close. The net was tightening, and we were running out of road. The next morning came slow and heavy. Fog clung to the ground like ghosts reluctant to let go. We didn't speak as we moved. Our voices felt too loud for the silence of the woods. Each step was a negotiation between caution and urgency. The world had narrowed to a single goal. Reach the ridge beyond the forest where shepherds travelled and roads forked into the east. Viva close. Our bodies were failing. My legs trembled with each incline, and Ahia limped, her wound now crusted but angry. But the air smelled of pine and freedom just beyond this stretch, so we told ourselves was the end of pursuit. And then we heard the horn. It cut through the air like a blade, a hunter's call, not for deer, but for us. We ran. We didn't choose direction, only speed. Down ravines, across shallow streams, past startled birds and rustling leaves. The world blurred. I felt blood in my mouth. My side screamed. I saw nothing but movement, breath, mud, light. My thoughts vanished. Only instinct remained. Seer und siehst. A fall. Alia slipped on wet rock, her leg buckling beneath her. She cried out, "Sharp, involuntary!" And I turned back, sliding down the slope to reach her. Her face was twisted with pain. The wound had reopened, bleeding now through torn cloth. "They'll be here soon," she said, her voice brittle. "You have to go. Nox, Peze, you must. Eat Tora's strips from my tunic. Tie them tight around her leg." Her fingers dug into the earth as she bit down pain. I looked around. No shelter, no cover, only open land. And then, behind us, the sound of hooves. Close. Though, close. Alia grabbed my wrist. "Lethius," she said. "You were free the moment you ran. Don't give that back now." "If I didn't leave you before," I said, "then don't leave me now. Not to die, but to mean something." She placed the flint in my hand, the one that you had given me, for fire or for memory. Tears stung my eyes, but I stood. I didn't run. He carried her. We moved slow, stumbling, half-dragging. Every sound behind us louder than it was. Every heartbeat a drum. But the ridge came into view, the trees thinning, the slope rising, and then the figures. 3? Maybe 4. Not riders. Shepherds, a wagon, woolsacks, faces, pale with surprise. One of them moved toward us. "Are you hurt?" I could barely speak. "Please," I rasped. "She needs help." Behind us, another horn. The shepherd turned. "Quick, under the wool, now!" The wool stank of lanolin and dust, but it was warm, and it hit us. I could feel Alia's breath beside me. Shallow, strained, but steady. The shepherd's voice drifted over us, calm, but tight with tension. He spoke with the ease of a man used to hiding truth beneath simplicity. Moments later, the riders arrived. Their voices were louder, sharper. "Fugitives," one barked. 2 of them, man and a girl. "Seen anything?" "No one but sheep," the shepherd answered. "Then what's in the wagon?" Wolf remarked. "Unless Rome's now texting that too." A silence followed, long enough to freeze the blood. Then the sound of footsteps circling the wagon. I held my breath so long my chest screamed. Aelia's fingers found mine beneath the wool. Whether she just touched. Then half-beats. Plink, half-beats. Retreating, half, reporting. To her room, half-beats. Retreating, half-beats. Returning, half-beats. And silence. The shepherd's face appeared between the wool folds. He nodded. "You'll ride with me to the bent. After that, the east road splits. Follow the sun." We moved again. Elio was too weak to walk far. The shepherd handed me a staff, gave her water and said little else. Just before we reached the crossroads, he stopped the cart and looked at me. "You'll need names," he said. I blinked. Names? New ones. For free folk. I hadn't thought of that. My mouth opened, but no words came. Aaliyah answered for us both. "I'm Livia," she said softly. I turned to her. She looked so pale yet so certain. "And you?" she asked. I paused. Let the amplification come again. Not Livius. That name had been given to me in chains. That name belonged to silence. I spoke my true name. The one my mother had whispered beneath starlight before Rome took everything. I hadn't said it in years, but when I did, it felt like the earth breathed with me. The shepherd nodded once, then handed me the reins. "From here," he said, "the path is yours." The sun broke through the clouds as we walked. Each step still hurt. My legs still ached. The past still clung to me like a scar. But the road stretched forward, open, endless. And this time, I chose it.